that's a really interesting question, because I became an archaeologist during I was a ranger out in the remote area of the Diamantina River, working on Australian Downs National Park. I was working with Peter McRae, who was a zoologist researching the last population, or the last known population of bilbies in far western Queensland. And the area out there is just such an incredible area. It's where we worked was virtually a treeless plain, big open spaces and incredible night skies, and it was just him and I there working on bilbies, and gave you time to think, and there was lots of researchers coming there researching different aspects of the ecology, and there was a guy working on owls, those leather-winged kites, and I saw all these researchers, and I thought that was incredibly interesting what they were doing. And I suppose I thought about my choice. If I was to make a choice what I'd do in my profession, I sort of thought about my background and being Aboriginal and so forth, from northwestern New South Wales. Mother was born at Gadooga, and so I sort of got to thinking about it and started seeing all these amazing sites, and seeing just rock shelters and stone arrangements, and lots of archaeological material just literally just laying on the surface and around the large water holes that are out in those areas. And I thought, well, maybe that's a way of doing what these researchers were coming out to do. I thought, well, what's been asking questions such as what's been done about all of these interesting places. And so I sort of started asking myself, well, where would I go to study that? So I ended up doing some research into where I could study, and came across the University of Queensland, and I went down to the, after a communication with them, and I went down and had an interview at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander unit at UQ, and that started my pathway to doing an archaeology degree, although you couldn't do an archaeology degree at UQ in those days. It was purely an anthropological based degree. But I had this other interest, which was also being very spatial that I am. I also done a spatial technologies major as well in the geography department in those days, and so I incorporated anthropology with my spatial interests, and majored in both of those, and then pretty much moved into a job soon after. I had to earn some money, like all of us have to do eventually, and so I applied for jobs soon after I finished my degree, and got a position as sites registrar at the Department of Environment and Heritage, and worked on the Indigenous Sites database, which essentially, well, that's what I named it, but essentially it was the all of the archaeological information that had been collected over, probably 3 to 5 decades and more, about Queensland's archaeological places. And so that was all sitting in just, incredibly large numbers of files and sort of filing cabinets. And so basically myself and I engaged a good mate of mine in those days. We graduated together, Cameron Harvey, and we set about turning this paper record into a digital record, and years later, a couple of years later after we finished it, it was written into legislation, into the new Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act of Queensland 2003, and that started my pathway to archaeology, and it's just been an incredible journey, starting with that, and I've just moved on from there. But it's been something that I've done that's really worthwhile, and it all originated out on the Diamantina Plains. Why micromorphology? Well, I sort of stumbled over it with being at Cambridge and sort of got to meet a range of professionals there and got to visit a lot of different labs, and for some reason I seem to be more associated with soils because of my honours research project, which I looked at soils there and how that affected site formation processes and why you see archaeological material dispersed on the surface, and it's all about soil tension, etc. But the soil micromorphology thing was a natural, or it seemed a natural progress of moving on to understanding, you know, the soil where everybody walks and everybody discards their materials, and so it was a sort of natural progression into understanding people through that. And micromorphology gives you a whole range of tools to look at not only, you know, the environment that people were living in, but also the types of sites that people were living in. And so it really provides an in-depth way of understanding the sites that you don't normally see through looking at a much lower resolution, and looking at the sites and photographing them and excavating the sites and seeing the features and so forth. You can actually go a few more steps further and look into the micro features and parts of the site that you don't normally see unless you actually look at it under a microscope. And there's so many features, micro features within those soils that tell you a lot about the types of fires or whether they were burning the landscape. It will tell you whether the ground was compacted, whether walking over it for any length of time. You can start to see a lot of features about whether it was a dry environment or a wet environment, or it was really wet and it dried out. So there's all these different ways of understanding how the site's formed and what it was like when people were living there. And that can be coupled with other proxies such as dating, so you can date the sediments and then start to build a picture and reconstruct the environment and look at it on a time scale as well. But it's such a powerful tool, and I think that Australia is probably in its early days of sort of using micromorphology as a tool to understand archaeological sites, and I think there's a future for it in Australia, even though it's been used, you know, in Europe and in the UK for a very long time, and it's just slowly got better and better. And there's a lot of experts in Europe and the UK now that really are using it to decipher the past, and there's certainly a lot more uses I think that we can use it for in Australia. The most rewarding aspect of being an archaeologist is being able to turn your interests into fruition in terms of being able to understand what it is you were looking at and ask a whole range of questions about a site or a place that's of interest to you and of interest to what you want to learn more about. And there's so many of those places in Australia, I think, that's still around that need answering. There's lots of questions that need answering. And so my favourite field experiences is wide and varied, because I find that archaeology is always interesting, and being an archaeologist, you can really do some really neat stuff, and some of my experiences are not necessarily in Australia. I have actually worked overseas, and I worked in Cyprus in about 2012, and looked at a Middle Bronze Age site over there with University of Queensland researchers actually, and that was an incredible experience just to see the archaeology from another culture, from another time, and be able to excavate the site and learn a lot about it, and have a hands-on and actually handle some of those amazing, really old materials. And we found some actual bronze and bronze pin and lots of jugs and evidence of where they were living, and all these different living floors, and a roof had caved in, so we saw lots of burnt materials and so forth, which obviously the place was, well, it seemed obvious at the time that people had set it alight, and so it had basically the roof had fallen in. But yeah, it's really good to work in other places, but in Australia it's it's always interesting being out on site, and that's what I enjoy the most. I'm more of a field archaeologist, I think, than anything. I love being in the lab, of course, but certainly field archaeology is fantastic, and it allows you to see different things, and you can't learn anything by sitting at your desk, so you have to get out and about. But one of the really interesting and favourite times for me was being in Alice Springs and doing some excavations of the old telegraph station, and working with Aboriginal prisoners, low security prisoners, and they came out for the week, and they were shy at first and sort of didn't seem to really worry too much, but eventually they got really interested in the excavations and really got into it, and it was really enjoyable to see them develop and change their attitude through the project, and they wanted to do more after that, and unfortunately I didn't do any more excavations after that in Alice Springs anyway, but yeah, it's good to be out on site with people and see them develop and change, and that's one of the things that I really enjoy about being a field archaeologist. So my advice for people that want to be an archaeologist is that you need to have a set of goals, and also have an interest in something that you want to look at in the future, because doing the study at first is a sort of a learning curve in terms of it teaches you a whole range of skills beyond what you're thinking about in the future, and it's those skills that set you up to become a really good archaeologist. And if you can put up with that and do that really well, and it is really a good thing to do, you then get out the other end of it, and you can go on to do an honours research project or a master's and eventually a PhD, and then become a specialist in the field that you wanted to be in. But it's that initial stage that you need to pick up all of those skills and really use those, thinking ahead and using those going forward. And so it's essential that you concentrate on that. And you'll be rewarded. That's the other side of it, is that if you have a passion for something and it's about finding out about previous cultures, or just understanding the site formation processes even of an archaeological site, or looking at it from a faunal perspective, and looking at the types of foods that people were eating in the past, or maybe you were looking at the people themselves and wanting to know what they were eating, doing all these other types of research. There's so many aspects of archaeology now that probably is not just the Indiana Jones in looking for treasures or anything like that. It's actually quite a diverse discipline, and you'll be rewarded no matter what interest you really have in looking into the past, and if it's DNA, looking into the DNA of soils even, or DNA of people, or there's just so many things you can do now, and I highly recommend it.